Hi, my name is Breda Carty. I wanted to say a happy National Week of Deaf People to you all. It's a very important week for the Australian deaf community, and in fact, deaf people all over the world, as it's the International Week of Deaf People. This week focuses on a whole host of different topics. This first day focuses on cherishing deaf history. So I've been contemplating the history of this organisation, Deaf Services and Deaf Society. Although not going too far into the detail of history, I did want to share the fact that the first CEO of Deaf Services in Queensland was a deaf man in 1903, Samuel Showell. He was the first and for a long time the only deaf person to lead a deaf organisation nationally. After he finished his employ, there was another deaf person who became a superintendent at that time, and her name was Martha Overend Wilson. When she ceased her tenure, that was 1925, and for a long time after her, there were no other deaf societies in Australia that had a deaf leader until approximately 2011. Again, this is in Queensland. At this time, it was Deaf Services Queensland, and this was Brett Casey. So Queensland really was a trailblazer in terms of deaf leadership. So I wanted to see if I could find any interesting stories that could provide a parallel between the deaf leadership that we've had in Samuel Showell and our current deaf leader, Brett Casey at Deaf Services. We see the beginnings of a story in some old notes that were found in a newsletter for the Victorian deaf community. And at that time, I was able to find information that could build a story. So please watch this interaction I was able to have with Brett.
Hi, Brett.
Hi, Breda. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Happy National Week of Deaf People to you.
Likewise, again, a wonderful week celebrating the life of deaf people. So happy National Week of Deaf People too.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing the different events taking place this week. I think it's going to be a great series of events and a wonderful celebration.
Yeah, we do have a complete schedule of various events happening. An example of that is storytelling in the style of visual vernacular and also the Ausam Leadership Challenge video. So there'll be a lot of things happening during that week.
It's interesting that you talk about leadership actually, and it connects well with what we're going to be talking about today. Now, as you know, today's the first day of National Week of Deaf People, and the focus is on cherishing deaf history. So, in thinking about talking to you, I wanted to share something with you from history that relates to leadership. Now, as you would know, of course, that Deaf Services was founded in 1903. At that time, it was called the Queensland Adult Deaf and Dumb Mission. Now, the name has gone through a series of changes over time, but interestingly, Queensland's first superintendent was a deaf man. His name was Samuel Showell, and I know that you have a photo of him there.
I do, actually, I do.
Yeah, so he was the first deaf superintendent of any deaf society. After him, many years passed, until the next deaf leader, and that leader is you. When did you start your role as CEO? What year?
CEO, 2010. So sitting around 10, 11 years.
Now, I was wondering, considering Samuel Showell and you are both deaf leaders, I wondered if there were other similarities or other commonalities between the two of you, rather than just being deaf leaders of a Queensland deaf organisation. But did you realise that both you and Samuel led the organisation through a pandemic?
Really? Okay.
So you're leading the organisation during COVID-19, which has been very difficult to manage, and Samuel led the organisation during the Spanish flu. This occurred from 1918 to 1919 and spread throughout the world, sadly claiming the lives of 50 million people. It was terrible.
It was very unfortunate.
Here in Australia, approximately 15,000 people died due to the Spanish flu during that period. So I wondered how Samuel Showell managed the organisation to make sure that people were okay, that the deaf community was okay. We're not quite sure, we're still piecing things together, but I did find an interesting story about something he experienced back then that was similar to something that you have experienced. And I remember you telling me something about what occurred to you in Christmas of last year when you went to visit family. You wanted to return to Queensland, but then faced a big problem. Would you share that story with us?
Okay, I was in Sydney for a little bit of work, and the lockdowns were over at that time, so I was able to work. I also visited family at the same time I was down there. Unfortunately, COVID in the North Sydney space resurrected itself again, and trying to manage that situation. And the Queensland government, as you know, each state government has its own directives or health orders. And the Queensland government decided to close their border again with New South Wales because of the risk of the pandemic spreading up to Queensland. And they mentioned that any Queenslanders that don't arrive back in Queensland on a particular date, they will have to hotel quarantine for a 14-day period. And so with that news, I quickly negotiated a ticket and packed my bags, and the next day headed to the airport, and I arrived on time. I got to the airport. They had security and police, not with machine guns, but police lining up. You had to talk to police, wear face masks. No, I asked them to move their face masks down because I had to lip read them, and they refused to. So we used pen and paper to communicate. And they said that you had to home quarantine for 14 days. And I said, well, no, that's tomorrow. The news said tomorrow that's the case and not today. And they went, no, the orders changed. You need to go for a test and then a home quarantine. And I asked, if I receive a negative test, can I leave the house? And that was in writing. I received that in writing from the police at the time. So I went and got tested. It was negative, and on that assumption, I thought I could leave the house. 3 days later, the police visited my home just to do a quarantine check to ensure that I was still home. They were just doing their spot checks at the time of everyone in quarantine. And luckily, I was at home at the time. The police came knocking on the door, rang the doorbell. I opened the door, went, oh, this is interesting. And they said, no, you've got to stay at home for 14 days. And I said, no. So luckily, the police at the airport, that we had that written conversation. I actually had written proof from that police officer showing that I can leave the house with a negative test. And they said, no, the police officer at the airport gave you the wrong advice. You need to stay at home for 14 days. And it was so hard to navigate the rules as they change so often. So unfortunately, I did have to stay home for 2 weeks. And luckily, it was at home and not at a hotel. And so I did have to put up with that for a little while.
That's a fascinating story. Please keep that story in mind, because I want to tell you what happened to Showell, the deaf superintendent. Now, Showell found himself in a similar circumstance. It was the Christmas period, and he was going to take a working holiday to Melbourne. This was Christmas 1918. I'm not sure how long he planned to stay, but the records that I have seen in Melbourne show that Showell, along with his wife and daughter, went to Melbourne, were involved in deaf community events, and then in January 1919, the Spanish flu hit. It was spreading, it was found in Melbourne, and there were soldiers returning from the war, exacerbating the spread. So Showell wanted to return to Brisbane, but that return was delayed because he was stuck in Melbourne for quite some time, several weeks. Now, returning to Brisbane was a different story for Showell compared to you. He couldn't take a 90-minute flight back home. He had to take a boat. It was a coastal steamer. And there are photos. Now, Showell's family was finally able to board the boat, and usually the trip from Melbourne to Brisbane would take approximately 5 days. Unfortunately, they faced many disruptions because of the Spanish flu. And that seemed to be the case for all modes of transport, that there were significant disruptions. So they realised after beginning the voyage that there wasn't enough coal on board to make the whole journey, so they had to turn back to Newcastle. So they made a detour to Newcastle, extending the time taken. They docked there to get more coal. The ship was quarantined there very briefly. So the boat stayed there and everyone had to remain on the boat, and finally they were able to depart once again and continue the journey to Queensland. Once they arrived in Queensland, it was the 7th of March. So altogether, the voyage took 9 days. Can you imagine? And I wonder how Showell managed the communication needs at that time with everybody on the boat and the restrictions that they were under. When they arrived in Brisbane, they had to quarantine. So a little like you. Unfortunately, not at home like you could in such restful surrounds, eating as you wished, but they had to quarantine at the Lytton Quarantine Station, near the mouth of the Brisbane River, where the river meets the sea. There was a very large quarantine station that was newly built there, and that was built due to the soldiers returning from the war, and they realised the soldiers were bringing the Spanish flu with them, and Australia was very concerned about the flu spreading further. So Showell and his family stayed there, likely for 2 weeks, like you had to quarantine. It doesn't appear like they had to quarantine on the ship, because I have found photos of the quarantine station showing the arrangement of tents, rows and rows and rows of tents that people had to stay in. So we don't have the complete story, but it looks like Showell and his family would have had to disembark from the ship and then stay in a tent for 14 days.
Wow, yeah, very similar experiences.
So a similar experience, just 100 years apart, a different way of transport, a different method of quarantining, and you're right, a different way of living. And I think two similar problems though that you experienced: communication issues, managing that kind of a situation. So I thought that was so fascinating that we found this historical parallel.
Yeah, I agree. You look at the communication barriers with the police at the airport, and then when they visited their house, I faced the same miscommunication. Fortunately, I do have pen and paper, and also technology available. We have technology available now to us that we didn't have 100 years ago.
Yes, you're right. Now, we know Showell's daughter was hearing, and perhaps, I'm not sure how old she was, but perhaps of an age where she could be interpreting as a coder would for their parents, so she may have been interpreting for her parents. But in reading these records and trying to gather the pieces of the story together, I wanted to find out if there were Queensland records that reflected the same dates and the same story. So to do so, we had to be a bit secretive about that and do some sleuthing. Because you were working from home, this is how we were able to check. Watch this video.
Yeah, the minutes from that long ago, I still have them. Wow. Amazing. So is it minuted in that book?
I was hoping for more detail, but there was a record there that showed that Showell had to be reimbursed for expenses made in Melbourne due to the delay there. And it was noted as a quarantine hindrance, old-fashioned language, to explain what he experienced due to the quarantine. And that was minuted in the book. So that confirms that it actually did happen. And here we are. The story's corroborated. It's amazing.
I've got some goosebumps. Yeah, two deaf leaders of the same organisation, 100-year apart, facing the same issue.
Yeah, and I thought it's a nice start to the National Week of Deaf People to look back and realise that deaf people have faced many challenges throughout history. We've faced a lot, and most of the time we've come out fine, doing well, but there have been difficult circumstances to face. So, I just wanted to share that story with you, Brett, at the beginning of National Week of Deaf People.
Lovely, and thank you. I do think it is quite lovely, especially linking to the history. And sometimes we do need to take time to look at our heritage, especially in the deaf community, the language and the culture. And that's why we're here today, to celebrate this week, our history.
Yeah, you're exactly right.
I still have goosebumps.
Oh, I'm so glad. I always like to give people goosebumps. Excellent. So, I look forward to this week, National Week of Deaf People, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch throughout the week. Enjoy.
I shall, and thank you for sharing that story with me, Breda. Wow, just wow, thank you. Bye.